The rain had started just before noon, turning the streets of Charleston, South Carolina into slick ribbons of gray. Inside the historic brick building that housed the law office of Carter and Bellamy, the atmosphere felt even heavier than the weather outside. The long walnut table in the conference room reflected the dim light of the chandelier above, and around it sat members of the Harrington family, waiting for a moment none of them had truly prepared for. At the head of the table stood Jonathan Bellamy, the family's attorney for more than 20 years. His hands rested on a thick folder sealed with a red ribbon. Inside were the final wishes of Edward Harrington, a respected businessman who had passed away from heart failure just 2 months earlier. Edward had built a regional construction company from nothing and had become known throughout the city for both his stubborn work ethic and his quiet generosity. But now he was gone, and what remained was a complicated mixture of grief, money, and unresolved tensions. Seated quietly near the end of the table was Margaret Harrington, Edward's widow of 46 years. She wore a simple navy dress and clasped her hands together in her lap, trying to steady them. The room felt unfamiliar without Edward's deep voice filling it with jokes or instructions. Even after weeks had passed, part of her still expected the door to open and for him to walk in complaining about traffic. Across from her sat their daughter, Caroline Whitmore. At 43, Caroline had perfected the look of success. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sharp bun, and the tailored cream blazer she wore looked like it belonged in a fashion magazine. But her fingers drummed impatiently on the polished wood table. She had insisted the will reading happen as soon as possible. 2 of Edward and Margaret's sons were also present. Daniel Harrington, the eldest, leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression, while Thomas Harrington, the youngest, sat beside his wife, quietly watching the tension build. At the far end of the room sat Edward's sister, Helen, who had flown in from Atlanta. Jonathan Bellamy cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is a difficult time for the Harrington family." His calm voice filled the room. "As you know, we are here for the official reading of the last will and testament of Edward James Harrington." Margaret lowered her eyes to the table. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began to confirm everyone's presence. "Margaret Harrington? I'm here," she said softly. "Caroline Whitmore?" Caroline straightened. "Present." "Daniel Harrington?" "Here." "Thomas Harrington?" Thomas nodded. Jonathan gave a small, professional smile. "Very well. We will begin." He carefully untied the red ribbon and opened the folder. "I, Edward James Harrington, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." The formal words echoed around the quiet room. For several minutes the document followed the standard legal language that opened most wills. But Margaret wasn't really listening. Her mind drifted back to the hospital room where Edward had squeezed her hand only days before he died. He had whispered something then. "Don't worry, everything's taken care of." At the time, she hadn't understood what he meant. Now she was about to find out. Jonathan continued reading until he reached the section that named the primary beneficiaries. "To my beloved wife, Margaret." "Excuse me." The interruption cut through the room like broken glass. Everyone turned. Caroline had pushed her chair back and was now standing. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with something far colder. "I'd like to say something before we continue." Jonathan frowned slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore, the reading." "It won't take long," Caroline said sharply. She turned toward the table, addressing everyone. "I think it needs to be said out loud that my mother should not receive any inheritance from my father's estate." Silence crashed over the room. Margaret blinked, as if she hadn't heard correctly. Daniel straightened in his chair. "Caroline, what are you doing?" Caroline ignored him. "She doesn't deserve it," she continued. "Everyone here knows that." Thomas stared at his sister in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" Caroline crossed her arms. "Dad spent his last years practically alone while she ran around with her social clubs and charity events. She barely paid attention to him." Margaret felt a tight knot form in her chest. Her voice barely came out. That isn't true. Caroline let out a bitter laugh. Oh, really? Who called him every day to make sure he took his medication? No one answered. Who drove across town when he needed help? Daniel shook his head. You visited once every couple weeks. At least I visited. Caroline snapped. Jonathan Bellamy raised a hand. Mrs. Whitmore, I must insist that we continue the reading without interruptions. Caroline's eyes flashed toward Margaret again. I just want it on record that my mother should not inherit anything. My father deserved better. Margaret felt the humiliation burn through her like a fever. Every person in the room was looking at her. For 46 years, she had shared her life with Edward. She had raised their children, supported his company, cared for him through surgeries and illness. And now her own daughter was accusing her of neglect. Daniel finally spoke. Caroline, stop. But she had already made her point. She sat back down slowly. Go ahead, she told the lawyer coldly. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then continued. To my beloved wife, Margaret Harrington, I leave the family residence on Magnolia Drive, along with all personal contents, and 50% of the remaining assets after specific bequests. Caroline's eyes widened slightly, but she stayed silent. Jonathan continued. To my daughter, Caroline Whitmore, I leave 20% of the remaining assets, along with my collection of rare historical manuscripts. Then came the portions for Daniel and Thomas, smaller shares along with business interests in Harrington Construction. Margaret barely heard the numbers. She was still replaying Caroline's words. The accusations. The coldness. Then Jonathan reached the final section. There is one additional provision attached to the distribution of the estate. His voice grew more serious. All primary beneficiaries must sign approval documents before any assets can be released from probate. He looked up from the paper. That includes Margaret Harrington. The meaning took a moment to settle over the room. Then Caroline leaned forward. What does that mean exactly? Jonathan folded his hands. It means the estate cannot be distributed without every beneficiary's signature. Caroline frowned. So, if someone refuses to sign? Jonathan met her eyes. Then no one receives anything. The room went completely silent. Margaret slowly lifted her head. For the first time since the meeting began, she looked directly at her daughter. Caroline's confident expression had vanished. Understanding was spreading across her face. Without Margaret's signature, the inheritance was frozen. The humiliation she had tried to inflict had suddenly turned into leverage. Jonathan closed the folder. That concludes the reading. Chairs shifted as people began to stand. But Caroline remained seated. Her gaze locked onto her mother. Margaret rose slowly and picked up her purse. She walked toward the door with quiet dignity. Just as her hand reached the handle, Caroline's voice followed her. Mom. Margaret stopped. We need to talk. For a moment she considered turning around, but instead she opened the door. Not today, she said calmly. Then she walked out into the rainy Charleston afternoon, leaving the stunned room behind her. And for the first time since Edward's death, Margaret realized something. Her husband had left her more than an inheritance. He had left her power. 3 days passed after the reading of Edward Harrington's will, and the quiet house on Magnolia Drive had not felt the same since. The large white colonial home had always carried the warmth of Edward's presence, the deep laughter that echoed through the hallways, the heavy footsteps across the hardwood floors, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen every morning at exactly 6 o'clock. Without him, the house seemed larger, emptier, almost unfamiliar. Margaret Harrington spent most of those days in Edward's study. The room had always been his sanctuary. Dark oak shelves lined the walls, filled with engineering manuals, old history books, and the leather-bound journals he had kept for decades. His desk still held the brass paperweight shaped like a compass that Daniel had given him for his 50th birthday. Margaret sat quietly in the chair across from the desk, her fingers resting on its smooth surface. On the table beside her phone screen were 32 missed calls, all from Caroline. Margaret hadn't answered a single one. Each time the phone rang, she watched the screen light up, waited for it to stop, and then returned to the silence. Outside the window, the garden Edward had planted years ago was beginning to bloom again. Red roses climbed along the fence, and the small fountain he had installed near the oak tree continued to run softly, its gentle sound drifting through the open window. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something close to calm. Then the doorbell rang. The sound echoed sharply through the quiet house. Margaret already knew who it was. She stood slowly and walked down the hallway toward the front door. The polished floor reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. When she reached the door, she paused for a moment. Through the glass panel, she could see Caroline standing on the porch. Her daughter looked different than she had during the will reading. The sharp confidence in her posture was gone. Her hair was slightly messy, and dark circles rested beneath her eyes. Caroline rang the bell again. "Mom, I know you're home." Margaret opened the door. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. "Can I come in?" Caroline asked. Her voice was quieter than usual. Margaret stepped aside without answering. Caroline walked into the house slowly, glancing around as if she hadn't been there in years. The familiar smell of furniture polish and fresh flowers filled the air. They moved into the living room. The large windows overlooked the garden, and Edward's favorite armchair still sat near the fireplace. Caroline sat down on the sofa while Margaret remained standing. "I've been trying to reach you," Caroline began. "I know." Caroline looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "About what I said at the will reading. I shouldn't have said it like that." Margaret watched her carefully. Something about the apology felt incomplete. "Why are you really here, Caroline?" Her daughter looked up. "What do you mean?" "You didn't come here to apologize." Caroline hesitated. Then she sighed heavily. "We need to settle the estate." Margaret remained silent. "The lawyer said nothing can move forward until everyone signs the approval documents." Still silence. Caroline leaned forward. "Mom, the house will probably need to be sold eventually anyway. It's huge. You don't need all this space." Margaret's voice remained calm. "The house isn't being sold." Caroline blinked. "What?" "Your father left it to me, but you can't stay here alone forever." "That isn't your decision." Caroline's jaw tightened. For a moment, the polite mask slipped. "Mom, please," she said, trying again. "This process is going to take months if we delay. Everyone just wants to move forward." Margaret sat down in the chair across from her. "And how quickly would things move if I signed today?" Caroline hesitated. The answer was obvious. Within weeks, the money would be distributed. Margaret studied her daughter's face carefully. "Caroline." "Yes. Tell me the truth." Her daughter shifted uncomfortably. "What truth? Why do you need the money so badly?" Caroline looked away. For several seconds the room remained silent except for the faint sound of the garden fountain outside. Finally Caroline spoke again. "I'm in trouble." Margaret felt her chest tighten slightly. "What kind of trouble?" Caroline's voice dropped. "Financial trouble." Margaret waited. "How much?" Caroline swallowed. "About $300,000. The number hung in the air like a thundercloud. Margaret stared at her daughter. "That's not just trouble, Caroline." Caroline's shoulders sagged. "I made some bad investments." "What kind of investments?" Caroline didn't answer immediately. "Things just got out of control." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "And humiliating me at the will reading was supposed to fix that?" Caroline's eyes filled with frustration. "I thought if everyone believed you treated Dad badly, you'd sign quickly just to end the embarrassment." Margaret felt something inside her go very still. "So that was your plan?" "I was desperate." Before Margaret could respond, the doorbell rang again. Both women turned toward the hallway. Margaret frowned. "I'm not expecting anyone." She walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the porch was Daniel. He held a large brown envelope in his hand. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." Daniel stepped inside and immediately noticed Caroline sitting in the living room. "Oh," he said quietly. "You're here too." Caroline crossed her arms. "What's in the envelope?" Daniel didn't answer her. Instead, he walked directly to Margaret and handed it to her. "Dad gave this to me last year," he said. "He told me to keep it safe and only give it to you after the will was read." Margaret looked at the envelope. Her name was written on the front in Edward's familiar handwriting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were several folded documents and a letter. Margaret unfolded the paper carefully. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began. "If you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to explain things myself." Margaret felt her throat tighten. She continued reading aloud. "Knowing Caroline, there's a good chance she tried to cause trouble during the will reading." Caroline shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. Edward's words continued. "6 months ago, Caroline came to me asking for money. She had accumulated serious debts and wanted me to cover them." Margaret glanced toward her daughter. Caroline stared at the floor. "I offered to help her create a payment plan," the letter continued. "But she refused. She wanted a large sum immediately." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she read the next lines. "When I told her no, she became angry. She accused you of controlling me and said she would challenge my will if I left you in charge of anything." Daniel stepped closer. "There's more in the envelope," he said quietly. Margaret opened the remaining documents. Inside were bank statements, large withdrawals highlighted in red. Caroline's name appeared on several transactions. Margaret looked up slowly. "You took money from your father's account?" Caroline's face had turned pale. "It wasn't like that." Daniel spoke firmly. "Those withdrawals happened over 4 months." Margaret's voice was calm. "Did your father know?" Caroline hesitated. "He said I could use it in emergencies." "For emergencies," Daniel said. "Not luxury trips and shopping." Margaret closed the folder slowly. The room felt heavier than before. For years she had believed the tension between her and Caroline was simply personality differences. Now the truth was clearer. Caroline stood suddenly. "You're all acting like I'm some kind of criminal." Margaret looked at her. "I'm not signing anything right now." Caroline's eyes widened. "Mom, you can't do that." "I can." Caroline's voice trembled. "I could lose everything." Margaret stood. "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before trying to destroy your father's trust in me." Daniel gathered the papers and placed them back in the envelope. "I'll keep these safe," he said. Caroline stared at both of them in disbelief. "This isn't over," she said quietly. Margaret walked toward the hallway. "No," she replied calmly. "It isn't." Caroline left the house minutes later, the front door slamming behind her. Daniel looked at his mother with concern. "You okay?" Margaret nodded slowly. But inside, something had changed. Edward hadn't just written a will. He had prepared for a battle. And now Margaret understood something very clearly. Her daughter wasn't finished yet. And desperate people often did the most dangerous things when they believed they had nothing left to lose. Nearly 2 weeks passed after Caroline's visit to the house on Magnolia Drive. During that time, Margaret Harrington spoke very little to anyone except Daniel and Thomas. The house had returned to its quiet rhythm, but beneath the calm surface, something heavy lingered in the air. Caroline had not stopped calling. Some of the messages sounded apologetic. Others were frustrated. A few were almost angry. Margaret listened to none of them. Instead, she spent long hours organizing Edward's papers in his study. The process felt strangely comforting. Each file, each notebook, each carefully labeled folder reflected the man Edward had always been: organized, methodical, thoughtful. But Margaret had begun to notice something else. Edward had been preparing, not just for his death, for conflict. Bank statements were neatly sorted. Legal notes were clipped together. Dates and transactions had been highlighted with careful precision. He had seen the storm coming long before anyone else had, and he had quietly built a shield around his wife. The invitation to dinner arrived through Daniel. He called Margaret one afternoon while she was watering the roses in the garden. Caroline wants everyone over for dinner on Sunday, he said carefully. Margaret paused. Everyone? Yes. She said she wants to make things right. Margaret looked toward the house. The white porch railings glowed in the evening sun. Do you believe that? She asked. Daniel hesitated. I don't know, but I think she's desperate. Margaret considered the idea for several seconds. Then she nodded slowly. All right. Sunday evening arrived warm and quiet. Caroline's home stood in a newer neighborhood across town. The large modern house with its tall windows and clean white walls looked like something from a real estate magazine. Everything about it felt polished. Perfect. Almost too perfect. Margaret stepped out of her car and walked up the stone pathway. Through the large front windows, she could see people already gathered inside. Caroline opened the door before Margaret even rang the bell. Mother, she said. The words sounded strangely formal. Margaret studied her daughter's face. Caroline looked composed again, dressed in an elegant black dress, her hair perfectly styled. The exhaustion Margaret had seen during the previous visit was gone. Come in, Caroline said politely. Inside the house, the dining table had been set with expensive china and crystal glasses. Candles burned softly in the center of the table. Daniel and Thomas were already there with their spouses. Caroline's husband, Richard, stood near the kitchen speaking quietly with Thomas. Two teenagers sat on the living room sofa scrolling through their phones. Caroline's children, Lily and Connor. They glanced up when Margaret entered. Hi, Grandma, Lily said with a small smile. Margaret's heart softened slightly. Hello, sweetheart. Caroline quickly stepped between them. Dinner's almost ready, she said brightly. Let's sit down. Everyone moved toward the dining table. The meal itself was elaborate. Roasted salmon, fresh vegetables, expensive wine. But the conversation felt strained. Every topic drifted toward safe subjects. Work, school, the weather. Caroline seemed determined to maintain control of the evening. Margaret watched quietly. She had lived long enough to recognize when someone was performing. After dessert was served, Caroline finally placed her napkin on the table and cleared her throat. I've been thinking a lot about Dad, she began. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. Here it comes. Caroline continued. He relied on me so much during his final months. Margaret slowly set down her fork. That's interesting, she said calmly. Caroline smiled tightly. It's true. I visited constantly. Made sure he was okay. Thomas frowned. Constantly. Caroline nodded. Sometimes several times a week. Margaret reached into her purse. I'm glad you brought that up. Caroline's smile faded slightly. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened a notes file. What are you doing? Caroline asked. Just refreshing my memory. Margaret scrolled calmly. March 14th, she read aloud. Edward's cardiology appointment. Caroline stiffened. You said you'd drive him. She looked up. But you canceled that morning because you had a spa appointment. The room went silent. Caroline laughed nervously. That was one time. Margaret continued scrolling. April 2nd. Physical therapy session. Daniel shifted in his chair. You forgot that one completely. Margaret nodded. Yes. Edward waited outside for 20 minutes before calling Daniel. Thomas sighed. Caroline's voice grew sharper. You've been keeping records? Margaret met her eyes. Yes. Caroline looked around the table, hoping for support. But no one spoke. Margaret continued. May 21st, neurology consultation. Caroline shifted uncomfortably. You told everyone you were there. Margaret's voice remained calm, but the hospital records list only one visitor. She paused. Me. Richard slowly lowered his glass. He looked at his wife. Caroline? She turned toward him quickly. This is ridiculous. Margaret's expression didn't change. Would you like to talk about the hospital incident? Caroline's eyes widened. What incident? Margaret leaned forward slightly. The one where Edward fell in the garage. Caroline immediately spoke.
Yes.
I rushed over and helped him. Margaret shook her head.
No.
The word was quiet but firm. The neighbor found him and called 911. Daniel nodded slowly. I met Mom at the hospital that night. Caroline's face flushed red. You're all twisting things. Margaret opened her purse again. This time she removed a folded piece of paper. Edward's letter. Your father knew about the lies, she said. Caroline froze. Richard looked confused. What lies? Margaret unfolded the letter. He wrote this before he died. Caroline's voice rose. You can't just. Margaret read the words aloud. Caroline has been telling people that Margaret neglects me, that she isn't present, that she doesn't care for my health. The room was completely silent. Margaret looked directly at her daughter. Your father wrote this 6 months before he died. Richard's expression hardened. Caroline, is this true? Caroline's composure finally cracked. You're turning everyone against me. Margaret stood slowly.
No.
She reached into her purse one more time and placed another document on the table. A printed bank statement. You did that yourself. Richard picked it up. His face changed as he read. What is this? Margaret answered calmly. Withdrawals from Edward's account. Richard looked at Caroline. You told me your business trip expenses were covered by the company. Caroline's voice trembled. They were investments. Daniel spoke quietly. Online gambling. The word landed like a stone in the middle of the room. Richard stood up. $300,000? Caroline looked at him desperately. It wasn't supposed to get that bad. Margaret watched silently. Years of confusion, frustration, and quiet suspicion were finally aligning into a clear picture. Caroline turned back toward her. If you don't sign the papers, I'll contest the will. Margaret didn't hesitate. You can try. Caroline's voice rose. I'll drag this through court for years. Margaret picked up her purse. Your father prepared for that too. Caroline blinked.
What?
Margaret looked at her one last time. There's a video. Richard's eyes widened. A video? Margaret nodded. Recorded with his attorney and neurologist. Caroline's face drained of color. He explains everything. The silence that followed felt almost heavy enough to touch. Richard slowly sat back down. Lily and Connor stood quietly in the hallway, listening. Margaret walked toward the front door. Before leaving, she turned back once more. I came here tonight hoping we could find some honesty. She paused. But you're still lying. Caroline didn't respond. Margaret opened the door and stepped outside. The cool night air felt refreshing against her skin. As she walked down the stone pathway toward her car, she heard voices rising inside the house. Arguments. Accusations. The truth had finally broken through the illusion Caroline had built. But Margaret knew something important. This battle wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The legal notice arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. Margaret Harrington found it tucked neatly inside her mailbox at the end of the driveway on Magnolia Drive. The envelope was thick, stamped with the logo of a law firm Margaret did not recognize. But she didn't need to read the return address to know who had sent it. She stood quietly beside the mailbox for a moment before opening it. Inside was a formal document printed on heavy legal paper. Notice of intent to contest the estate of Edward James Harrington. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. So it had begun. The accusations listed inside were exactly what she had expected, though seeing them written down still made her chest tighten. Caroline's legal team claimed that Edward Harrington had been manipulated during the final months of his life. They argued that Margaret had influenced the will while Edward was mentally weakened by illness. They accused her of isolating him from family, of controlling his finances, of taking advantage of his failing health. Margaret folded the document carefully and walked back toward the house. The roses in the garden were blooming beautifully that morning, bright red petals opening under the warm sunlight. Edward would have liked that. Inside the house, Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee before calling Jonathan Bellamy. The attorney answered immediately. I was expecting your call, he said calmly. You've already seen the notice?
Yes.
Caroline's lawyer filed it yesterday. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. So, it's official. Jonathan's voice remained steady. Don't worry, Margaret. Edward anticipated this. Margaret heard those words again.
He anticipated this.
She drove to Jonathan's office later that afternoon. The same conference room where the will had first been read now held a completely different atmosphere. Instead of tension between family members, the table was covered with folders, documents, and organized stacks of evidence. Jonathan gestured toward a chair. Sit down. There's something you need to see. Margaret took her seat. Jonathan opened one of the folders. Edward started preparing for this nearly a year ago. Margaret blinked.
A year?
Jonathan nodded. He began documenting everything once he realized Caroline might try to challenge the estate. He slid several photographs across the table. Margaret leaned forward. The photos showed Caroline entering a law office downtown. The date printed in the corner was 11 months before Edward's death. She was already consulting lawyers about challenging the will, Jonathan explained. Margaret felt a chill. She planned it that early? Jonathan nodded again. And that's not all. He opened another folder. Inside were printed bank records, highlighted transactions, attempts to access Edward's investment accounts. Margaret frowned. She tried to log into his accounts several times. Jonathan pointed to another page. And here she tried to convince a bank employee she had power of attorney. Margaret stared at the documents. The level of planning shocked her. Caroline hadn't acted impulsively. She had been building a strategy for months. Jonathan reached into his briefcase and removed a small case containing a DVD. But the most important piece of evidence is this. Margaret looked at it. What is it? Jonathan smiled slightly. Edward's insurance policy. He inserted the disc into his laptop and turned the screen toward her. The video began. Edward Harrington appeared on the screen sitting behind his desk in the study at Magnolia Drive. He looked older than Margaret remembered, but his posture was strong and his voice steady. My name is Edward James Harrington, he began. The camera angle shifted slightly. Two other people were visible in the room. Jonathan Bellamy himself. And a woman Margaret recognized immediately. Dr. Laura Bennett, Edward's neurologist. Edward continued speaking clearly. This video is being recorded on June 15th in the presence of my attorney and my physician to confirm that I am of sound mind while creating my will. Dr. Bennett spoke briefly, confirming Edward had passed several cognitive tests during the recording. Margaret felt tears rising in her eyes. Edward had been so careful, so thorough. The video continued. I am making this recording because I believe my daughter Caroline Whitmore may attempt to challenge my will after my death. Margaret watched the screen. Edward's voice remained calm but firm. Caroline has recently accumulated significant personal debt. She asked me for a large amount of money to cover it. He paused slightly. When I refused, she threatened to accuse Margaret of manipulating me. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. Edward continued speaking. My wife has cared for me faithfully for 46 years. She has never once asked for control of my finances or my estate. The camera zoomed slightly closer. If anyone tries to claim that Margaret influenced this will, they are lying. Jonathan paused the video. Margaret wiped her eyes quietly. I had no idea he was doing all this. Jonathan nodded. He didn't want to burden you while he was alive. Margaret stared at the frozen image of Edward on the screen. Even in preparation for death, he had been protecting her. The court hearing arrived 6 months later. The courthouse in Charleston stood tall and imposing, its white columns casting long shadows across the stone steps. Inside, the courtroom was crowded. Family members filled several rows behind the lawyers. Margaret sat beside Jonathan at the front. Across the aisle sat Caroline and her legal team. Caroline looked exhausted. The confidence she once carried had faded into something brittle and strained. The judge, Margaret Chen, entered the courtroom and took her seat. The hearing began. Caroline's lawyer spoke first. He painted a picture of Margaret as a controlling wife who had isolated Edward from his daughter during his illness. He argued that Edward had been vulnerable, that the will had been written under emotional pressure. Margaret sat quietly, listening to the accusations. Jonathan had warned her this would happen. When it was their turn to respond, Jonathan stood calmly. "Your Honor," he said, "the evidence will show that Edward Harrington was not manipulated. In fact, the only manipulation attempted in this case came from the plaintiff." He gestured toward the screen. "I would like to present recorded testimony." The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. Edward appeared on the screen again. His voice filled the courtroom. Margaret watched Caroline's face as her father described the threats, the financial demands, the lies. Caroline stared at the table. "The evidence," continued. "Bank records, investigation reports, text messages retrieved from Caroline's phone. Each piece told the same story." By the time the video ended, the courtroom had grown completely silent. Judge Chun reviewed the documents carefully. Several long minutes passed. Finally, she spoke. "The evidence clearly demonstrates that Edward Harrington was mentally competent when he created his will." She looked toward Caroline. "The court finds no basis for the claim of undue influence." Caroline's lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, we request additional time to consider an appeal." Judge Chun raised her hand. "The will stands as written." Her gavel struck the desk. "Case dismissed." The sound echoed through the courtroom. Margaret exhaled slowly. The battle was over. As people began leaving the courtroom, someone touched Margaret's shoulder. She turned. It was Richard, Caroline's husband. He looked pale. "Margaret, may we talk for a moment?" They stepped into the hallway. Richard spoke quietly. "I'm filing for divorce." Margaret looked at him sadly. "I didn't know about the gambling," he said. "Or the debts. Or any of this." Margaret nodded. "What about the children?" "They'll stay with me." He sighed. "Caroline needs help." Margaret watched him carefully. "I hope she finds it." Behind them, the courtroom doors opened. Caroline walked out slowly. Her eyes burned with anger. "This isn't over," she said bitterly. Margaret met her gaze calmly. "Yes," she said, "it is." But deep inside, Margaret knew something. Winning the case was only the end of the legal battle. The real question remained unanswered. What would she do with the power Edward had left in her hands? And what would become of the daughter who had nearly destroyed their family? The legal battle ended on a quiet Thursday afternoon, but for Margaret Harrington the real decision was only beginning. The following morning, she returned to Jonathan Bellamy's office for what was supposed to be the final administrative meeting regarding Edward's estate. The courtroom victory meant the will could now be executed exactly as Edward had written it. The family house on Magnolia Drive was officially hers. 50% of the estate would transfer into her accounts, while the remaining shares would be distributed among the children. Everything had gone exactly according to Edward's plan. Yet Margaret did not feel triumphant. She sat across from Jonathan in the same conference room where the will had been read months earlier. The long walnut table looked exactly the same, but the tension that once filled the room had changed into something quieter, something reflective. Jonathan slid a stack of documents toward her. "These are the final authorization forms," he explained. "Once you sign these, the estate will begin distributing funds to the beneficiaries." Margaret studied the papers, but didn't pick up the pen. Jonathan noticed the hesitation. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Margaret leaned back slightly. "Yes." Jonathan waited patiently. She had always appreciated that about him. Unlike many lawyers who rush through conversations, Jonathan had the habit of letting silence do its work. "I've been thinking about Caroline," Margaret said finally. Jonathan folded his hands. "That's understandable." Margaret looked out the large window beside the table. The Charleston streets below bustled with afternoon traffic, people moving through their daily routines without knowing anything about the Harrington family's conflict. "My husband prepared for everything," she said quietly, "except what happens afterward." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Margaret turned back to him. The will gives Caroline 20%. Yes. She still receives it. That's correct. Margaret nodded slowly. Jonathan studied her expression. You're considering changing something. Margaret allowed a small smile. You know me too well. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Edward trusted you with that authority. Margaret finally picked up the pen. But I'm not planning to take her inheritance away. Jonathan looked curious. Then what kind of change are you considering? Margaret placed the pen back on the table. I want to create a trust. Jonathan waited. For Lily and Connor. Caroline's children. Jonathan's expression softened. That's a thoughtful idea. They shouldn't suffer for their mother's mistakes, Margaret said firmly. Jonathan nodded. Agreed. Margaret continued explaining her plan carefully. She wanted a portion of the estate placed into education funds for the grandchildren. The trust would cover college tuition, healthcare needs, and provide them with financial stability as they entered adulthood. Jonathan listened carefully, occasionally writing notes. And Caroline? He asked after a moment. Margaret took a slow breath. She still receives her 20%. Jonathan looked slightly surprised. After everything that happened? Margaret folded her hands. Yes. Jonathan waited for the rest, but with conditions. He smiled slightly. I had a feeling. Margaret explained calmly. Caroline would receive access to her inheritance only after completing two requirements. First, she would attend a financial responsibility program to learn how to manage money properly. Second, she would commit to at least 1 year of family therapy. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. And if she refuses? Then her share transfers into the children's trust. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. Edward would be proud of you. Margaret felt her chest tighten slightly at the mention of her husband. I hope so. A week later, Margaret invited the entire family to Magnolia Drive. The house felt different that evening. The warm light from the dining room chandelier spilled into the hallway, and the smell of fresh cooking filled the air. Daniel arrived first with his wife. Then Thomas and his family. Caroline arrived last. She looked smaller somehow. The confident businesswoman who once walked into every room like she owned it had disappeared. In her place stood someone quieter, uncertain. Richard was not with her. Margaret had heard about the divorce proceedings. The grandchildren ran into the house ahead of their mother. Grandma, Lily called happily. Margaret hugged both children warmly. Seeing their smiles reminded her why she had made the decisions she had. Once everyone gathered around the dining table, Margaret stood. I asked everyone here tonight because the estate is ready to be finalized. The room grew quiet. Caroline stared down at the table. Margaret continued. The will remains exactly as Edward wrote it. Daniel nodded. Thomas relaxed slightly. Caroline looked up slowly. But I've added some modifications. Jonathan Bellamy, who sat near the end of the table, passed out several documents. Margaret explained the trust for Lily and Connor first. Both teenagers looked surprised. Connor whispered, Does this mean college is covered? Margaret smiled. Yes. Lily's eyes filled with tears. Caroline stared at the papers in front of her. Why would you do this? She asked quietly. Margaret answered simply, Because they deserve stability. Caroline swallowed. And me? Margaret met her eyes. You still receive your share. Caroline blinked in disbelief. But there are conditions. Margaret explained the requirements calmly. Financial counseling, family therapy, accountability. As Margaret spoke, Caroline's eyes slowly filled with tears. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Margaret nodded slightly. You're right. The room grew very still. But your children deserve a mother who learns from her mistakes. Caroline wiped her face. I ruined everything. Margaret shook her head gently.
No. She paused.
You made terrible choices. But that doesn't mean your story has to end there. Caroline suddenly stood and walked around the table. For a moment, everyone watched in silence. Then she stopped in front of Margaret. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Not the defensive apology she had offered before. This one sounded different.
Raw.
Honest. Margaret looked into her daughter's eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Humility. Caroline leaned forward and hugged her. The embrace felt awkward at first, but Margaret returned it. Not because the past had been erased, but because the future still mattered. 2 years later, the house on Magnolia Drive felt alive again. The garden Edward loved had grown fuller than ever. Bright flowers surrounded the fountain, and new trees had been planted along the fence. Lily was preparing for college. Connor had discovered a passion for photography. Their laughter filled the house during weekend visits. Caroline arrived one afternoon to pick them up. She looked different now. Simpler clothes, softer posture. Months of therapy had slowly reshaped the sharp edges that once defined her. "Mom," she said gently. The words sounded natural again. Margaret smiled. "How was your therapy session this week?" Caroline shrugged slightly. "Hard, but good." They watched Connor chasing a butterfly through the garden. "I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately," Caroline said. Margaret nodded. "So have I." Caroline hesitated. "I found an old video he recorded years ago. He was talking about you." Margaret looked curious. "What did he say?" Caroline smiled softly. "He said you were the strongest person he'd ever known." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "That sounds like him." Caroline looked down for a moment. "I hope someday I can be half the person he believed you were." Margaret placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Strength isn't about being perfect." Caroline looked up. "Then what is it?" Margaret watched the sunlight reflecting off the fountain water. "It's about learning when to stand firm and when to forgive." Caroline nodded slowly. "I'm still learning." Margaret smiled. "So am I." Later that evening, after everyone left, Margaret walked into Edward's study. The room looked almost the same as it had when he was alive. His desk, his books, his favorite chair. On the desk sat a framed photo taken at Lily's birthday party. The entire family stood together. Even Caroline. Margaret picked up the frame. "You trusted me to handle it," she whispered softly. The quiet house seemed peaceful. Edward had left her money, property, security. But those things weren't his greatest gift. His real gift had been the trust he placed in her judgment. The belief that she would protect their family, even when it meant choosing compassion instead of revenge. Margaret placed the photo back on the desk. Outside, the garden fountain continued to run quietly. And for the first time since Edward's death, the house no longer felt empty. It felt full. Full of life. Full of second chances. And full of the quiet strength that sometimes grows only after everything else has been tested. The story had not ended with loss. It had ended with something far more powerful. A family rebuilt. And a woman who had finally discovered just how strong she truly was.